welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. It is May 16th. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee, and we're going to start talking a little bit more about the House versus NCAA case. It sounds like we're starting to get a little bit closer to a settlement, but there's still a lot of ways to go. So I want to break down where they are right now, what kind of the implications are, and what the official price tag is going to be for the NCAA back paying some of the NIL payments they need to. And then we'll get into one of the consequences of this case, which could be lower roster size, which means no walk-ons in the future, which I definitely want to break down for you all. Definitely something that a lot of college football fans love about the sport, so definitely don't want to see that go, but it might be necessary for the future of the sport. But we'll break down NC State and Virginia. They set up a non-conference home and home. Kind of want to get into what the implications of that and why I don't love that decision just overall for the future of college football. Then we'll get into the transfer portal a little bit more. Still some guys out there that have yet to make their decisions and some guys that have finally made their decisions and found where they're going to play, including Cormani McClain. So I want to break down all of that for you guys. And then we'll get into a hot take Thursday, and it's all about the running backs today. Want to break down why I think 2024 is going to be a huge year for the guys in the backfield. But before we jump into everything, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a little bit of a fun interactive experience here, maybe call me out for something I didn't bring up or ask a question that you're wondering about. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in. The House versus NCAA case has been something we've been watching for quite some time. It's definitely going to be a very, very impactful thing in college football, and it feels like it's starting to roll down the road. Now, the House versus NCAA, if you're not aware, is an NIL back pay case, which essentially is just a couple of players, or a bunch of players to be fair, about 7,000 players from the past in college sports, suing the NCAA for essentially what they would have made in NIL money. And that number we'll get to a little bit later in kind of the details of it. It sounds like it's going to be about $2.776 billion from the NCAA's part. That will pull some from school distribution, some from just the NCAA having to pay that check. So we'll get into all that as this kind of goes on. But this resolves a ton of different cases for the NCAA if they can get this settled. Obviously, it settles this one, but also Hubbard versus the NCAA, Carter versus the NCAA. Both of these are very big NIL cases right now, and the NCAA is trying their hardest to get this off of their plate, and it's definitely something that they're trying to expedite. Now, the settlement is having to agree on a couple of really, really big things. We talked about the billions of dollars in back damages to the former athletes for NIL payments, also a new compensation model permitting schools to share up to $22 million a year with their athletes, so that's that revenue sharing that we've talked about a little bit on the show, and then annually, or this would be an annually capped system with athletes, so this is a very interesting thing where you can go to 22, but you can also go below that if you need to, which I'm sure a lot of these schools will need to, which we'll get into as this kind of rolls on. And also an overhaul of the NCAA scholarship and roster structure, which is something we'll get into in the next segment more, but kind of just want to break down what this all means for the schools in particular. So that number is $2.7 billion, as we talked about, and that needs to come from somewhere, right? And a lot of it is going to come from that distribution that has gone out to a bunch of the teams over the last couple of years. That number is roughly around $700 million that the NCAA sends out every single year to these schools. Well, that's going to be cut by about a fifth, by about $160 million a year. That will be cut, and it will be kind of distributed between the teams. The power leagues apparently are expecting to lose about $1 to $2 million a year. So not the biggest hit necessarily on the big boys up top. Definitely will be a bigger hit for the smaller schools that don't necessarily have as much, $2 million to spare as the Texas and the Georgias and the Alabamas of the world. So this will be really, really interesting. 60% of that that will take care of about 60% of this payment because it's a 10-year deal to make these payments about $277 million annually. So about 60% of that will come from the schools, and then the NCAA has to cover the other 40%. And that is a huge chunk of change for the NCAA, and definitely does not necessarily help them when you talk about the future of college football in particular, and college sports overall, and them being able to keep this power dynamic that they currently have. Well, that might be hurt a little bit if you have to pay this money over the next couple of years, but the alternative is much worse for them. So we've talked about this a little bit, but they need to settle this case, and they need to do it as quickly as possible, and this might be the deal that is as advantageous for them as it can be, because if this thing goes to trial, we've talked about, that number being even quadrupled up to, there have been reports that they could be on the hook for $20 billion. So the amounts that would be, that would skyrocket over the time that you are in a courtroom trying to figure all this out would be insane. It would totally turn this entire sport on its head, the entire athletic structure in college football on its head if the NCAA had to pay that, because a lot of it's coming from the colleges, as we just talked about with this current setup. So a big time element of this is obviously you want to make sure that there's new rules of compensation in place. That being said, with this settlement in particular, because that is going to take some time to set up, they have reaffirmed the current set of rules that the NCAA has had. So kind of a very interesting thing where it's hard to really tell what the rules are, right? What the rules and regulations are, but there are some around compensation, NIL, and that type of thing. But they decided to reaffirm those, but also push them to create new rules around compensation. One of the big ones has been what happens to collectives in this grand scheme, because as we all know, I think NIL has become something that it probably wasn't supposed to be, right? I think we can all agree that there definitely should have been more rules around it, because now you have NIL collectives that are essentially just funneling money from boosters to kids without necessarily having to do anything for it, not doing, the community service, the different monikers that were supposed to be passed to get this money are not necessarily being abided by. So that's something that has been a big question mark. A lot of people want to bring them into the university. A lot of people say that's not possible because of antitrust laws and things of that nature. Well, they're going to try to make that happen. It sounds like with this settlement, there will be economic incentives to bring the collective inside the university, and also a prohibition on any booster payments that are not true NIL. Now, how does that work in terms of actually enforcing those rules? I'm very uncertain. I think it's very likely that we say that on the surface, and then the same type of thing starts happening until we get a real structure in place for what athletes are going to look like in the future. They did leave the idea open that they could be athletes in the or not athletes, of course they're athletes. They could be employees in the future of the university or of the conference. I've said many times on here, I think that's probably the best way forward if we're just trying to make this as crystalline and as good of a structure as possible. Collective bargaining for athletes is something that we've talked about a lot, and it's something that's probably going to be vital for the future of the sport, not only from a standpoint of making sure that all of this is understood and normal, but also just making sure that the people that are affected the most, the athletes on the field, are the ones that are, having these conversations about compensation, about transfer portal, about roster construction, about all of this stuff that impacts them way more than it impacts anyone else. So I think that's going to be a big part of this. I've heard there's been a little bit of pushback from the NCAA with the collective bargaining, but when you look at what needs to be done, I think there's really no way around it. I guess the best way to put it. You're going to have a players association at some point, and if you don't, it could become a big time problem down the road. And I think there's going to be a tons of questions, as we go on throughout this. Obviously, is the 21 million or 22 million that the schools can distribute, how far down the line does that go? I know that Ohio State can do it. I know that Georgia can do it. I know that Texas can do it. But can, Vandy do it? Can Georgia Tech do it? Can these smaller schools that are still Power 5 schools and still big programs, can they afford to give up that amount of money? Because when you talk about what the next 10 years will look like, it's about $300 million that you're adding to your books over the next decade. And that's, 22 or 21 million per year through the revenue sharing. That's 2 million being withheld from you from the NCAA distribution on the back payment damages. And then you have $10 million that likely will go towards additional scholarships and things of that nature to other sports other than college football. So it's going to be fascinating to watch all of this and how the tightrope walk that is going to be keeping all of these budgets in place is going to happen, because there's a lot of places that have a ton of wiggle room. There's way more places that have essentially none. And then the big kind of question mark with all of this is, if you settle this one, it handles, those three cases we talked about at the very beginning, where you handle the House, you handle Hubbard versus NCAA, you handle a ton of different cases, including Carter versus NCAA. But what you don't handle is future cases. And I think it's a little naive of the NCAA to think if they're going to get this off the table, then no one else is going to come to the table with new problems, with new issues about this new setup. It's going to happen. I don't think there's a reality where they're going to be able to implement all of this stuff and do all of this stuff, and especially pay the back payments, admit that, the NIL rules that they had in place before were not correct or not the way that it should have been done, and not expect more people to come ask for their money. So it's going to be fascinating to watch all of this. I think this is, the tip of the iceberg for the NCAA, to be totally honest with you. But you need to get this off the books. You need to make sure that you don't have to fight these 3 or 4 or 5 antitrust cases that they have out there right now. But it doesn't mean that those are going to stop altogether. It doesn't mean that those are going away or that other people won't come forward, right? But in the next segment, I do want to get into what is going to be a very impactful change that could be happening. It sounds like scholarship limitations are going to be in place, as well as roster limitations. And that introduces a very, very interesting thing for college sports, and especially college football, where walk-ons likely are not a thing. So I want to break down what that kind of means and how I don't necessarily love that for the future of college football right after this. So stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows or 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the House versus NCAA case and how they're coming to a little bit of a settlement. But I do want to talk about one of the outcomes of what that settlement could be, which is the end of walk-ons in college football. This is something that obviously we do not want. We've had incredible stories, Baker Mayfield walking on at Texas Tech and Oklahoma and becoming the player he was. Stetson Bennett walking on at Georgia twice and becoming the player that he was. So you don't want to lose those stories by any means, but let's just give you an idea of what this means and why this is kind of happening. So we talked about the roster and scholarship limitations that could be happening through the NCAA or House versus NCAA settlement case, and that is something that has been pushed for quite some time, but it sounds like that might be coming to fruition. The scholarship limits for sports, so it's 85 in football, if you're not aware, would be eliminated. So you would be able to allot scholarships on your team as you saw fit, and you wouldn't necessarily have this big cap on it. The difference is there would be a roster cap on a lot of these sports. Specifically, football would be at 85. So that would mean there wouldn't be those walk-on players that don't get scholarships on your team necessarily. You would have 85 players. They would all have scholarships, and that would just be the way of the world. And this is kind of in a way to help other sports. And I know that's something that college football fans don't love to hear. You want college football to be the main thing worried about at all times of the day. But at the end of the day, there are tons of other sports that you have to worry about, especially with the new payments that are coming up for these athletic departments. And one way to do that is to limit the football spending. And the best way to do that, the most expendable way to do that, is to cut walk-ons from the roster. Now, obviously, walk-ons don't necessarily cost you too much, but there is a cost-cutting effect here where you have to travel with them, you have to get them equipment, you have to pay them what are called Alston payments, which are essentially an academic scholarship that are about $5,000-6,000 per semester. So it's a very interesting thing where you're not necessarily cutting tons of money, but you multiply that over tons of teams and tons of players that are walk-ons. It starts to add up a little bit. Also, it gives other sports a little bit more leeway where the scholarship for baseball, for example, you have 35 baseball players on any NCAA roster, but there are only 11.7 scholarships to spread around that entire roster. That makes things a little bit sketchier, not only for the people that are setting up these scholarships and deciding how to distribute them, but for the players having these kind of conversations and saying, I'm on a .3 scholarship. It's a weird thing to kind of think about. So this would kind of at least make way for more of these guys to be on full scholarship, more of these guys to have that ability, but maybe a slightly smaller team. That could be something else they add into the baseball structure as well. So it's something that is going to be really fascinating to watch. I think it's one of those things where you never want this to happen. You never want a bunch of kids to have that, dream of theirs to play college football at a very high level to be taken away from them. But there are really good reasons for this to be happening, and it sucks that it is, but when you look at, the grand scheme of things and you look at all of the questions that are in front of college football right now, there are going to be sacrifices that are just have to be made, plain and simple. So this is one where it does take away a certain aspect of the game, I'm not going to lie to you, but it definitely does limit some of the money that is expendable. That makes it a little bit easier to, make those books work in a world where a lot of them aren't in the grand scheme of things. But, among cost cutting, there are a couple other reasons why this is becoming such a big thing and why this is likely going to be implemented in the future. And one of them is obviously trying to cut off that future litigation that could come to the NCAA or to some of these schools and all of this type of thing. So definitely something that they want to curb as much as possible. A roster cap is something that's a little bit easier to defend in the court of law than something that is a little bit more arbitrary, like these scholarships limitations or having walk-ons, and it just gets a little bit more confusing than having 85 guys. They're all on scholarship. You know exactly what all of them is getting, at least in that realm of things, and it makes everything just a little bit easier. At least that's what they seem to think with this conversation. And then you have the final one, which is teams are already going over that scholarship limit. Now, it doesn't look like, we're handing you a piece of paper that says you have a scholarship. So they don't have 86 guys that have, written things that say they have a scholarship. But let's be honest, with NIL, with all of the different things that you can give these kids money for, a lot of these kids have a ton of their college education and things covered. And some of them have the entire thing covered. So I think there is that reality where it's already happening. Why not limit the roster space so you don't have the ability to do that anymore? You have the same amount of scholarships as you have rosters, so what are you going to do? You can't go over it because then you're going over the roster cap and then you get in actual trouble with the NCAA. So there are loopholes with scholarships. There's not as much loopholes with the amount of people you're allowed to have on the roster. So that's kind of the easiest way to put all that. And this is something that's been pushed for a little bit here. I mean, Greg Sankey over the SEC, he's the commissioner over there. He's been wanting to do this in basketball and football in particular. It didn't work back then, but it's back now, obviously. So it's definitely something that is going to be really, really fascinating. Obviously, football is going to get the most shine here. It's going to be talked about the most. People are going to concern about football the most. But the reality is, when you look at a ton of different college football players and situations, I think one of the very interesting things is when we talk about college football, a lot of the walk-ons that we talk about throughout the year are the kickers, are the punters, are long snappers, or are Stetson Bennett early on in his career. And I think some of the interesting things is when you talk about those players, you now have to fit them into the scholarship players. You now have to figure out your roster to not only, you're going to have to limit the number of defensive and offensive players you can give scholarships to, because you got to find a way to get it to that kicker, to that punter, to that long snapper, to the, second, third string linebacker that doesn't have a scholarship right now. Because when that roster cap hits, some guys who are currently outside the 85 scholarship positions are just going to have to come into it. And it creates, a little bit of an issue with, roster construction, but also football is a very physical sport. Kids are going to get hurt, and it makes it a lot more imperative that you have kids in your back end that can play pretty much immediately. And with the transfer portal, that makes everything a little bit more complicated. So in terms of a roster construction and roster management standpoint, this is near a nightmare, because you had that 35 guys that were not on scholarship, that if you absolutely needed them, a break glass in case of emergency type of group, you had them there. You will no longer have them there. You now have to have your starting lineup guys have to be as healthy as possible. But not only that, the backups and the third strings have to be as healthy as possible, because we've seen games where even at the quarterback position, you've had one guy start a game, one guy play the second quarter because the first one got injured, and then someone else finished the game because the second guy got injured. So this stuff happens very, very consistently, and we've seen it in the NFL where you have to decide how many quarterbacks you want to take on an active roster. Do you want to take 2? Do you want to take 3? It's a decision that is a little bit tougher with the kind of grand scheme things, but it's definitely going to make roster construction really tough. It's definitely going to make the jobs of the GMs around the country, the Courtney Morgans of the world, a lot tougher. I won't lie to you. But when you look at the impact on individual players, it's kind of an interesting one. You obviously want players to be able to play at, those big schools. Stetson Bennett being able to go to Georgia is a really cool thing, because he grew up a Georgia fan. It was a very fun thing for Georgia fans to have someone like that representing their university. But at the end of the day, if Stetson Bennett, didn't make the first 85-man cut back in, I think, 2017, I could be wrong about that, whenever it was, he would just go to group of 5 team, right? He would just, take that next step down, keep it moving, and, continue to play college football, which to me is a little bit unfortunate to a certain extent, because you want these guys to be able to play where they want, right? If they want to take a walk-on place at Georgia rather than a scholarship place at Troy, that's their decision. And if they want to be a Georgia Bulldog, that's more than fine. And I think that's something that you'll definitely miss with all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, as long as these kids get a chance to play college football, as long as they're on the field, and as long as they possibly have the chance to step up into that Power 5 arena later on in their career, I don't think it's necessarily the biggest hit. It's definitely not what you want. You don't want these incredible stories to go away, but there still will be incredible stories, right? There will still be the guy that is really deep on the depth chart that finds their way into a starting role and blows up. That guy just won't, that guy just won't be a walk-on. That guy will just have his school being paid for. So it's one of those things that I think people will be very upset about. People will be angry about, but once we get into the actual football, once we get into the actual season, I'm not sure if you'll notice very much. And it sucks that, some of these players are going to have to make some different decisions during that recruiting period. But I think in the long run, it doesn't necessarily change the overarching identity of college football. It hurts it a little bit, I won't lie to you there, but it definitely does. It definitely doesn't hurt quite as much as some people might have you believe, I suppose. There is, the opposite direction where they've thought about, doing no roster caps, and Alabama can have 125 football scholarships, and Vandy could have 35 scholarship baseball players because they love that sport over there, and you could have no scholarship basketball players. Like, that is a reality that is out there. Frankly, that would be a really, really weird and more complicated way to go about this, but at the end of the day, you don't want walk-ons to go away. You don't want those stories to go away. But it's still the same kid, right? It's still, he might just be at Troy now instead of Georgia, and he might, not have quite as much ability to become the darling of whatever team they're at, but they do still have the ability to play college football. They do still have the ability to be on the field and possibly make their way up to that higher level. So definitely not what you want. Definitely not what you had hoped for this future of college football. But I think it was one of those things that was probably going to be reality. No matter how you cut it, if I had to make that decision, it wouldn't be the case. But you got to start cutting costs at some point, and that's an easy and efficient way to do it. So stinks for a lot of kids out there and some college football fans for that mystic that is behind all these walk-ons, but at the end of the day, it is an easy and efficient way to cut some of the costs, to continue moving forward, and to keep some of the non-revenue sports alive, which is a huge part of what the future of college sports is about. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that. I think it's going to be one of those things that people are not going to be very happy about, but you'll probably hear that lesson and lesson throughout time. But we're going to take our second break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about Virginia and NC State. They scheduled a non-conference home and home. So I want to get into why they did that, why I don't love that they did that, and why I think it's a very, very fixable problem in college football in general. So I'll break that down for you guys after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about walk-ons and how they could be a thing of the past in college football. Definitely not what you want to see, but costs have to be cut, and people are not going to be very kind about it as they go about it. But let's get into NC State and Virginia. This is a very, very interesting story that I think some people might just overlook and just continue on with their day, but has a lot of implications for the future. So Virginia and NC State decided on Wednesday they were going to play a home and home. That's all well and good, but they decided to play an out-of-conference home and home, which makes it very, very interesting. And this is going to start in 2025 in North Carolina, in Raleigh, and then they'll go to Charlottesville, Virginia in 2026. This is the second time a pair of ACC rivals have set up this. Wake Forest and North Carolina did this in 2019 and 2021. They wanted to kind of keep that rivalry alive. This is probably another example of you want to play that team more often, so you try to get them on the schedule more often. So this is obviously, in part due to the divisions being scrapped from the ACC and from pretty much every conference across the country over the last little bit. It makes scheduling a little bit tougher, especially in a conference with 17 teams where you can't cut it straight down the middle and make it, divisions, or at least just make it a rotating model. It makes it a little bit harder to get all of these teams on the schedule as frequently as you would like. So definitely something that they have been pushing for. Virginia and NC State had played each other 60 times since they started in 1904, but it's diminished since 2005, and they've only played 7 times since then. So they definitely really want to play that game. They weren't scheduled to play until 2027, so decided to add in 2 more until then, and definitely a very interesting thing. Something that I think a lot of people will, overlook and say, whatever, they can do what they want. But there are a couple things happening here that not only affect Virginia and NC State, but affect everyone. And one that is just as common sense as it gets that for some reason has not happened in college football. But one of them is something, one of them is something that has been happening for quite some time, which is Group of 5 teams are being put to the side. That's just kind of the way the world has gone with the playoff and with conference realignment and everything in between, the group of 5 teams are just getting kind of swept under the rug. They're trying to push them to the side, and it's very frustrating to me for a number of reasons. But the number one reason to me is just you don't want to lose to that team. And that's really, really frustrating. You don't want to be Texas A&M losing to App State, and you don't want to be that team that gets made fun of because you lose to a smaller team. That's ridiculous. And I get that, you want to play Virginia, and Virginia wants to play NC State, and you want that matchup. But you guys can play in 2027, or you can set up something that should have been set up in college football for 50 years now, which is uniform scheduling. I don't know why this has not been a thing for the past decade at least, but it hasn't. And it's created, tens of millions of problems for the college football and the way that we talk about college football, specifically the way that we talk about the SEC comparative to other conferences. The SEC plays 8 conference games, everyone else plays 9, and everyone else tells the SEC that they're running away from conference games when they do that. And obviously, 8 conference games in the SEC is a little bit different than 9 in the ACC, but it's crazy that they're not playing the same number of conference games. I'm not saying that the SEC is, doing anything wrong by playing the number of games they are, but the reality is everyone should be playing the same number of conference games, everyone should be playing the same number of out-of-conference major games, and everyone should be playing the same number of FCS teams, which is 0. So I'll break down a couple of the ideas that I have here, and it's a lot of the ideas that I just talked about, where play 8 conference games a year. I'm fine with that number. I'd rather it be 9 if I'm being totally honest with you, but if 8's the number, that's all well and good. I think we can all be okay with that, and that's something that should be a layup. It makes it a little bit easier with some of the scheduling stuff. Obviously, the ACC having 17 teams it makes that a little bit tougher, but there's a way to make the math work. There's no doubt in my mind. So 8 conference games a year feels like a good place to land, with all of these conferences expanding and just making everything a little bit more uniform across the board. Then you have to play 2 out-of-conference games that are Power 5 teams, and they can't be in your conference. You can't just call them out-of-conference games because you want to. NC State could have very easily called up Indiana and gone and played in Bloomington. Virginia could have very easily called up Texas Tech and gone to Lubbock and played a game. They decided not to. And they'll tell you that they wanted to keep the rivalry alive, but I don't necessarily buy that as much as they want to sell that to you. So you have to play out-of-conference games. They have to be Power 5 teams because those are the games we want to see, the weird games that we haven't seen in the past. The Virginia against Texas Tech is a wild game. That are 2 teams that have, to my knowledge, have never played each other, at least not in the recent history, and absolutely would be a very, very interesting thing to watch. Now, is it the most fascinating 2 teams in the world? Probably not, but give us more of those games, and then you get the Penn States against Texas and the Michigan against Tennessee and all of these different games that would be so much fun to watch. But it starts with these type of games where if NC State and Virginia start to schedule themselves, what's stopping, Vandy from scheduling South Carolina or for an out-of-conference game? And it's a snowball that we do not want to roll down that hill, and it could be pretty catastrophic if it does. And then finally, you must play at least 2 group of 5 teams. I think this is a layup. You want to keep those group of 5 teams involved, but you don't want to play them every single week, and you don't want to have to necessarily go and face them all the time. So I feel like 2 a year is normal. I think you could do even 1 a year and bump up the conference games a little bit, but at the end of the day, it helps those group of 5 teams get a little bit, on a bigger stage, maybe get a check that they very much need. A couple of things that just have to happen. No FCS teams. I'm not budging on that one. The fact that anyone plays an FCS team is ridiculous to me. You're playing 2 totally different sports, but that's beside the point. I do think that there is a solution to FCS teams losing out on the money that they do make from those games. It's something that Josh Pate on his show has brought up a number of times, which is have these teams play in the spring. You can opt in, you can opt out, that's your own business, but why doesn't Georgia play, Kennesaw State or someone around them that is an FCS team that, could use that little bit of money, but you don't necessarily need to play them in the fall. You can play them in the spring. You can have a real spring game and, frankly, probably beat up on a team and give your guys the reps that they need, but also, still give that team the little bit of money that they need and keep your schedule as intact and as tough as it possibly can be, because that's what we want as college football fans. So it's going to be one of those things that for some reason we have not come to this decision before. For some reason we've just kept kicking the can down the road and acting like we didn't need uniform scheduling across the sport, especially across the Power 5 conferences. But we absolutely do. I understand that the Big Ten and the SEC are tougher conferences. I understand that playing more conference games for them is going to be tougher than playing in the Big 12 or the ACC. But the reality is, you are where you are, and you play the teams that are in front of you, and with those 2 out-of-conference Power 5 games, you can even the scales just a little bit in terms of, the schedule that you're playing and how tough it's going to be and that type of thing. So overall, when we talk about, NC State and Virginia scheduling this game, it's relatively benign, right? At this very moment, it's a relatively benign change where you're just going to see NC State play Virginia, and whoever wins, it won't affect their conference record. That's whatever. It doesn't necessarily affect you this year or when they're even playing in 25 and 26. The issue is it's slowly squeezing out the teams that make college football special, in my opinion, in the group of 5 teams that are a little bit smaller that go to these big universities and say they can compete with these teams. And then you lose a little bit of, the interesting nature of some of these weird out-of-conference games that we get every year. And also, I think it's just NC State and Virginia being a little bit scared to face those group of 5 teams that could knock you off your pedestal and could make you a joke around some social media, some different things. So I think it's a number of things that are playing into this, but I don't like any of them. I'll be totally honest with you. I think it's insane to me that we have not set up a uniform scheduling model already. It's insane to me that they're allowed to do this type of thing. Because if I was the ACC, I would immediately come in the room and say, no, go call Colorado, go call Texas Tech, go call Arizona, and schedule a game that's actually out of conference. But at the end of the day, they did what they did. And if uniform scheduling was in place, they probably wouldn't have, because they wouldn't have had to wait till 2027 to play this game again. But hopefully that's something that'll get figured out. I think that's a very manageable problem. You just get the commissioners in a room, have them agree to a normal model that they all should agree to if they're not, being ridiculous, which maybe they will be, to be totally honest with you. But this sport can be, I don't want to necessarily put a number on it, but this sport can be a lot more fun than it is right now in terms of scheduling. And this is a great example of how it can be a lot more fun than NC State and Virginia playing again. So I don't like this one bit. I wish that NC State and Virginia didn't do it, but I also wish that we had uniform scheduling so they didn't even think about doing this. But that's the world we live in. Hopefully this is fixed at some point in the near future, but a very, very interesting thing that will definitely be fascinating to watch in the next couple of years. But we're going to take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the transfer portal. There are a couple of guys that have committed, including Cormani McClain. He has found his new home, but also a ton of intel on guys that are still sitting out there that some teams really, really need. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about NC State and Virginia scheduling an out-of-conference home and home. Not something I love by any means, but let's get into the transfer portal and let's talk about this spring portal that has been a little bit wild. Definitely not quite as wild as I anticipated it to be, but there's still some names out there that are definitely big-time names. Now we have some commitments that I want to get to before we jump into all the guys that are still out there, and it starts with the quarterback position. We had two guys that maybe a little bit under the radar, but definitely are big-time transfers for both their teams. General Booty has committed to ULM. He is going to be a Warhawk for this upcoming season. A very interesting one because it sounded like Iowa was in on this recruitment for a little bit. Now I don't know how aggressively they were recruiting him, but very interesting if they were recruiting him very hard and he decided to go to ULM. But it's very interesting for a number of reasons, mainly because he's transferring from Oklahoma, and he still gets a shot at Texas this upcoming year. ULM starts their year against the Longhorns, so I can bet that General Booty will be ready to roll going into that game. We'll definitely have a little bit extra motivation in that one. And then you have Taquan Roberson. This is someone that started a ton of games for UConn a year ago, was a very, very solid player for them. Not necessarily what Avery Johnson is, but he is committed to Kansas State to be Avery Johnson's backup. This is something that I think is going to be huge for them, not because, he is Avery Johnson and can do what Avery Johnson can do. They definitely need him to be healthy and to do what they want to do this upcoming year. Avery Johnson has got to be on the field. But if you're talking about a safety net, if you're talking about break class in a case of emergency, this is a great guy to have. He's a very good player that has played a lot of football in his time. Definitely can extend plays with his legs. Not necessarily the runner that Avery Johnson is, but a good safety net nonetheless for the Wildcats over there. And then you had Javarius Johnson. He is committed to UCF, this is a guy coming over from Auburn. He was a wide receiver there. UCF's just been doing absolute work. They've brought in KJ Jefferson early on in the portal cycle back in winter, but also brought in Penny Boone from this cycle. Ajay Hall is going to be a walk-on that team this upcoming year, a guy that was on Alabama and Texas in the past, so very, very talented. You brought in Ja'Cory Brown, who likely will take over for KJ Jefferson in 25, and now you have Javarius Johnson, who is going to play a big-time role for them this upcoming year. So Gus Malzahn has seen kind of a slight opening in the Big 12 and wants to kind of throw his hat into the ring. I think if he can thread a needle and get the most out of this team, they are a team that will be very interesting to watch in the Big 12 this upcoming year. And then you had Eli Stowers. He was pretty much the only tight end on the board that was a big-time name. He is finally committed to Vandy. He's coming from New Mexico State, appeared in 15 games, caught 35 passes for 366 yards. But the very interesting thing about this guy is he also threw passes, and he ran the ball because he was a former quarterback. This guy's an elite athlete, so he's very, very interesting person to have where you can put him at Wildcat quarterback, and he can throw a couple of passes for you. He went 4 for 8 with 99 yards a year ago, had 108 yards on 22 attempts rushing from that position. So a very, very interesting guy that Vandy might just use in weird ways because you got to get a little bit weird when you're giving up the talent that Vandy is giving up in a lot of these games they play. And then you have Curtis Perry on the defensive line, a guy that I've been watching very, very closely coming from Alabama. He was making visits around to Indiana, to Virginia Tech, to a couple other Big Ten teams, but he's landed at Virginia Tech. He's going to be a Hokie. This is a huge pickup for them. They definitely need some help on that defensive line and just that defense in general to make sure that having Kyron Jones on your roster does not go to waste, because that guy can change the complexion of your season, can make you an ACC contender right away. And then when you add someone who is an SEC type of guy in Curtis Perry, things tend to go pretty well, to be totally honest with you. And then you have JVR Scruggs, another defensive lineman. He is committed to LSU, which is music to LSU fans' ears. They absolutely needed a defensive lineman. They finally got one. And this is a guy that is coming up from the D2 level from Grand Valley State. So some people might turn their nose up at that. They might scoff and say, write him off as just another guy that is not going to catch on. But this dude can play football. There's no two ways about that. And there's plenty of success stories of kids coming from the JUCO or the D2 level to the D1 level and playing big parts. Now, LSU and the SEC is a little bit different of a ball game than some of these other places, but the reality is this kid can play, and he's going to have to be able to play for LSU to be successful. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this guy. He's definitely someone that is going to be pushed into a role that maybe he's capable of filling, maybe he's not. It'll be fascinating to watch. If he can fill that role, the LSU defense might not be quite as bad as some people might think. And then you have Lejon Cavallos. He is committed to Michigan State, a very talented corner, someone coming over from UNC. UNC's kind of gotten hurt throughout this transfer portal world over the last couple of years, to be honest. And Jonathan Smith absolutely needed this. This spring cycle has not been kind to the Spartans by any means, and adding someone like this to the back end of your defense just make you feel good for a second is definitely a big time plus. You lost a guy in that back end in Jaden Mangum that is a huge player, but adding someone like Cavallos definitely makes that a little bit easier to deal with. And then the big time name on the market right now is Cormani McClain. He has finally committed to Florida. This is something we kind of expected the last time we talked. He was visiting there, and it felt like the papers were essentially signed. Now, the very, very interesting thing about this is it doesn't sound like he's going to get a scholarship there. It sounds like he's going to be a walk-on like Ajay Hall, which is wild to me for a number of reasons. I mean, not even a year ago, this kid was a 5-star coming into Colorado with insane amounts of hype, and now he's a walk-on at Florida. And it's not that he cannot be incredibly successful. He absolutely can be. But it's one of those very, very weird instances where this kid was a 5-star, the number one corner in the entire country, and now he's a walk-on at a school that probably wanted them coming out of high school. So it's a very, very interesting thing. I don't know if it's, related to some of the things that came out during his time at Colorado, where maybe he wasn't the hardest worker that you wanted in your locker room. Maybe he took a little bit of time off when he probably shouldn't have. But maybe this is, the chip on his shoulder that he absolutely needs. Maybe this is the, knocking him down a peg will give him the perspective he needs on his situation and become the player that he's capable of being. Because the reality is, this kid's got talent out the door. He can do incredible things on the football field and can be a huge piece for this Florida team. He just won't be taking up a scholarship. So a very, very interesting thing. I'd be a little bit surprised if he was a walk-on for very long there, but definitely a big decision by him, and one that kind of shows some of the humility that has kind of been imparted on him throughout the last year or so. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that one unfold. Definitely a very interesting decision for him, but it might be the best one for his football future, if I'm being totally honest. But let's jump into some of the guys that are still on the board, and it's a ton of really, really talented guys, especially on the defensive side of the ball, which is where we're going to focus pretty much all of our energy here today. Elijah Badger is a wide receiver that it seems like he's making his decision today between Florida, Arizona, and Washington. I would be very surprised if it wasn't Florida, I guess is the best way to put that. You'll find out later today at some point, but I think it's going to be the Gators on that one as well. But a pair of Louisville transfers on the defensive side of the ball might be making their way to Baton Rouge, and it would be absolutely huge for LSU if they could pull that off. Wesley Walker is the first guy on this list who I conveniently left off my big board here, but Wesley Walker is a very talented safety that has played a ton of football. 45 career games, has 184 tackles, was at Georgia Tech to start his career, then Tennessee, then Louisville, now might be at LSU. So definitely has bounced around a good bit, but you need experience if you're LSU, and this guy can absolutely give you that. Then you have Tyler Barron, who is a remarkably talented edge rusher. We've talked about USC and Miami and Ole Miss a ton. Well, LSU has thrown their hat into the ring, and I think this would be an absolutely massive win for LSU. I think more and more people, including Pete Nakos and Steve Wiltfong, the guys that follow this more than anyone else in the world, I think they're starting to lean more in that LSU direction as well. It's going to be really, really interesting. Now, there is a little bit of a hurdle there where he committed to LSU this winter, if you recall, before going to Louisville, and the problem with that is he has to get released from that paperwork before he can play for LSU. So I'm sure Ole Miss will do that. I'm sure that is not as big of a hurdle to jump over as some might think, but definitely a very interesting thing that if Ole Miss does not release him from that, he might just have to sit on the bench for a year, which would not be what LSU wants by any means. And then you have Khalil Jacobs. He's bouncing around right now. He's visited Auburn, is at Ole Miss right now, canceled 2 visits to Bama and Missouri, but it sounds like he wants to reschedule those. If I'm being totally honest, I think he's not going to get off the campus at Ole Miss. I think Ole Miss is going to try to lock this guy down. I think putting him next to Chris Paul Jr. would just be incredible for them, and I think they'll make it happen today, if I'm being totally honest with you. And then you have Aiden Huntington, a very talented D lineman that is a ULM guy, actually, where General Booty ended up. And he's going to where General Booty came from. Oklahoma sounds like they're very much in on this kid. When you lose someone like Jermaine Lole to Texas the way they did, you definitely need someone to backfill that. And Aiden Huntington would be a great pickup for them. And then you have Thomas Gore, a D lineman to watch from Miami, played all 13 games for them a year ago. He currently seems to be deciding between Tulane and Georgia Tech. Would be a huge player for either of those teams. I lean towards Georgia Tech direction just because they are the power conference. They have that ability, but who knows? Tulane has a lot going for them. John Summerall is a great recruiter, so we'll see what happens there. But as you can see, LSU is making a little bit of a run here. They're starting to kind of put together a little bit of a portal class that maybe won't be the last in the SEC as it is right now, which is not what you want at all. If they can reel in Wesley Walker and Tyler Barron and maybe even Brandon Lane, another guy, a D lineman from Stephen F. Austin that was committed to Michigan State, has now decommitted. If they can bring in some of those guys, it becomes a much better class and changes the complexion of LSU's season pretty much overnight. So we'll watch it very closely over the next little bit. The portal is, closed and no more people can enter, but there's still tons of recruiting going on and some big-time players still out there, including Tyler Barron, probably the top of the list there. But we're going to take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about a Hot Take Thursday I have about the running back position coming into this year and how it might be in as best of shape as it's been in a number of years. So we'll break that down right after this. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the transfer portal intel that has been coming out over the last couple of days. Cormani McClain has committed to Florida as a walk-on, so a very, very interesting thing there. But let's get into a Hot Take Thursday, and let's talk about the running backs. There has been a ton of talk about running backs over the last couple of years in the NFL and in college football, and particularly in the NFL draft this last year. We kept hearing about how it wasn't the strongest RB class and how, Jonathan Brooks was the top running back taken. He wasn't taken till the second round and kind of the middle of the second round. So gives you an idea of what this running back class was looking like. Well, it left us a ton to look forward to in the running back class for this upcoming year. I broke in the players into a couple of different tiers, if you will, where I have the Doak Walker candidates, I have kind of backfield stars, and then kind of the best of the rest at the end. So want to break these down for you guys, and let's start with the Doak Walker candidates. And there is way more than you would think. There are so many guys that have the ability to make big-time plays this upcoming year and be insanely good. And it starts with those two Ohio State guys, Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson. I've talked about them a lot. Frankly, I think Travion Henderson is better than Quinshon Judkins, but that's beside the point. I think he might be the best running back in the country, but we can get to that a little bit later down the road. Jaden Ott's another guy that is going to be incredible for Cal, will play as big a part as any individual player will play in the ACC this upcoming year. Donovan Edwards over at Michigan is an obvious candidate, a guy that is coming off an incredible national championship, and especially with Blake Corum walking out the door. Another hot take for you, I think Donovan Edwards is better than Blake Corum, but especially with him walking out the door, you start to get more carries, start to be able to show that ability a little bit more, and he has tons of it to go around. And then you have Ollie Gordon, obviously the reigning Doak Walker Award winner from Oklahoma State. He's going to have a sweet offensive line to run behind, and it's going to make for some big-time holes for him, and he tends to do really, really good things if you give him some space to run. So I think he's going to have an incredible year. If he can repeat with that trophy, it'll be something to behold, that's for sure. And then you have Omarion Hampton, a guy from UNC that some UNC fans were a little bit nervous that he might walk out the door during that spring portal window. Definitely a name that was brought up a little bit, but he stayed put, and that is a huge thing for UNC. They're going to need that running game a ton this upcoming year. Max Johnson coming in from Texas A&M as their quarterback. It's going to be a run-heavy offense, that's for sure, and definitely Omarion Hampton is going to get as many carries as pretty much anyone on this list. So it'll be fascinating to see what he can do this upcoming year. Taj Brooks is a very interesting guy from Texas Tech. He is someone that I talked about a couple of days ago. I think he's going to be able to rival Ollie Gordon in the Big 12 this upcoming year. The dude has incredible change of pace. The dude is incredibly physical at the point of attack. So he's someone that can definitely be a big-time player for them. And if that offensive line can come together with a couple of big-time transfers, could become the best running back in the entire country. Then you have Ashton Jainty up there at Boise State, the only Group of 5 guy on this whole list, honestly, and that's honestly probably not correct. There's a couple other guys that I probably should have given some love to. In fact, there's one guy I left off here that I'll actually get to in a little bit, but he's someone that is incredibly talented. You can make the argument that he is a top 3 or 4 running back in the entire country. I would be one of those that would make that argument, to be fair. So he's someone that I'm very fascinated to watch next to Malachi Nelson up there for the Broncos this upcoming year. Then you have Damian Martinez down at Miami. I think he's someone that he came over from Oregon State during the spring portal cycle, and I think when you look at what Miami has at the offensive line, this guy was already really good at Oregon State. I think he's only going to be better at Miami, and he's going to totally change this team and could end in a Doak Walker Award for him. But let's move on to this second tier, and I have them as the backfield stars this upcoming year. I do have Devin Neal in here, the Kansas running back, a remarkably talented kid that can do so many remarkable things on the football field. Will definitely be a huge help to Jalen Daniels in that offense. Has been there for quite some time, so he'll be more than fine. They have Highshaw right behind him, but Devin Neal will get the majority of the carries there. Trevor Etienne coming over from Florida to UGA was a massive pickup for them. He's someone that I think is going to get a lot of run as a kind of receiving back because of what Carson Beck brings to that offense, and also because of the other running backs you have. You have Roderick Robinson, you have Branson Robinson, who likely will come back from an injury sometime during fall camp. So you have those physical runners. You now have a guy that is a little bit more finesse and definitely can make those plays out on the outside for you. So really like Trevor Etienne. I think he's going to have a big-time year. Jaden Blue is someone at Texas who you'll hear a lot of people talk about CJ Baxter. I think Jaden Blue is going to be their go-to guy this upcoming year. He's just incredible, is remarkably explosive. The second he hits a hole, he's pretty much halfway down the field at that point. He can do incredible things with the football in his hands, and I think especially with Jonathan Brooks walking out the door and Jaden Blue coming into that role even more, I think he's going to be a huge player for them. Then you have Nicholas Singleton, an incredible, incredible player that can absolutely be the linchpin for that offense, but he's right next to Katron Allen, who absolutely is one of these players as well. He can do incredible things, and this duo is as good as it gets in the country. I think we all have them right up there with Ohio State and with Michigan and some of these other programs that have big-time players. In fact, Khalil Mullings absolutely could be on one of these lists as well. So very, very talented guys there. You have Dylan Edwards, who came over from Colorado to Kansas State this offseason. This dude's just an outright athlete. He's a game changer. He can absolutely do anything on the football field you need him to do, and he's going to have to for Kansas State. He's definitely going to play a huge part in that offense, and I think if you put him in the right situations, he could find himself into that Doak Walker conversation just because of how dynamic he is. And then you have Montrell Johnson Jr., the guy that is kind of taking over for Trevor Etienne. He played a big part in the offense while Trevor Etienne was still there, but is definitely going to be a big-time player for them now that Etienne has moved on to UGA. I think having Montrell Johnson makes Florida feel a little bit better about Trevor Etienne moving on. A very talented kid that will definitely play as big of a part in their offense as anyone on that team. So will be fascinating to watch him. And then you have the best of the rest. And I started off with the two UCF guys, RJ Harvey and Penny Boone. RJ Harvey has been there for quite some time, a very, very talented kid that is a little bit more of a physical runner. Now, Penny Boone is a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more of a pass-catching guy. He was big time in the MAC, definitely had some interesting transfer stories with trying to go to Kentucky but not having the academics to go there, and some confusing things that have happened. But still a kid that can do incredible things on the football field, and a huge pickup for UCF late on in this process. Then you have Phil Maffa, an incredible player at Clemson that can definitely play some big-time ball with Will Shipley moving on, will be that big-time player for them. DJ Giddens at Kansas State is another guy. That duo up there at Kansas State is about as good as it gets as well. And then you have Rocket Sanders at Arkansas, incredible player that has only been getting better throughout his college career. Justice Haynes and Jamarian Miller is another incredible duo. And then you have CJ Baxter there at the end. Him with Jaden Blue is right up there as well. So it gives you an idea of just how good this group is. When I go through all this list, and the last name on it was the guy that was starting for Texas to start the year before he got a little bit dinged up and Jonathan Brooks came in and tore up everything. It gives you an idea of what this running back room and what this running back group for college football looks like. Now, there's other guys. There's the running back over at Rutgers that's a remarkable player that I am blanking on his name right now, but I promise I know that he is a very good player. Some other players that are just remarkable across the board that might just be a little bit younger. I think Branson Robinson is someone from UGA that could make his way into this list throughout the year. Roger Robinson, another one. So there's tons of really, really fantastic guys. And then, you know, Dylan Edwards, Trevor Etienne, Nicholas Singleton not being the top flight running backs in the country is insane, just given how good those guys are and how talented they are. Having, you know, a tire, you know, maybe 10 guys above those is just insane to me. So you have guys across the country as well, whether it's the SEC, Big 10, Big 12, ACC. There's running back talent all over the place. The SEC has tons of it. The Big 10 has tons of it. But there's plenty of ACC guys. You have Phil Maffa. You have a couple other guys that are going to play big-time roles for their teams. You have Jay Knott, who's one of the best in the entire country, coming in with Cal. So it's going to be incredible to watch all of this unfold. I think when you look across the country and you look at one position in particular that has not only guys that are, you know, have a ton of potential, but really proven guys, you look no further than running back. It's remarkable the number of guys that are out there, and I think there's going to be a lot of teams that lean on them very aggressively and have some pretty potent running attacks this upcoming year. So love this group. I think there's going to be a very intense conversation about the Doak Walker Award, and I can't imagine we come to the end of the year and a ton of fan bases are not super upset. So we'll break that down as it comes to us. I won't make my pick for Doak Walker Award right now, but I do have a name in mind that might not be the name that you're thinking. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, we invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We have incredible people doing work for across every single sport you could possibly think of. So definitely come on over to GSMC and we have you covered with anything you could possibly need. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.